Exactly. So back to ridicule as praxis, right? Like the specific details of the technology as marketed is far less interesting and far less relevant to our readers than how does this system work? What do you need to know to be able to spot the hype yourself, deflate the hype yourself? And those things, we hope that people will get them from our book.
Hello, and welcome back to Tomato Tomato. I'm your host, Talia Sherman. On today's episode, I'm joined by Emily M. Bender and Alex Hanna, the co-authors of their new book, The AI Con. As the title implies, this book is not about the technological composition of any particular quote-unquote AI product, but rather a searing exposition of the ways that so-called artificial intelligence technology functions or has functioned sociologically, politically, historically, etc. Time and time again, Emily and Alex will tell you that this isn't really about any current technology. This is about how and why these technologies exploit existing power inequities and simply aren't the panacea that they're often purported to be. I read the AI Con as a critical takedown, yes, but also as an instruction manual for how to live in this world of overhyped products. That is to say, this book is accessible, it's funny, and it's designed to imbue readers with confidence. My conversation with Emily and Alex traces their process writing this book, their takes on this technology, the philosophical and political implications of their arguments, particularly about how this technology may devalue what it means to be human. And throughout, you'll see what happens when different disciplines come together to create something. The result, more often than not, I believe, is a more multi-layered, nuanced approach to a problem. And in this case, that problem is the economic and political undercurrents producing this particular moment of AI hype. It was my privilege to showcase the perspective of a linguist and a sociologist jointly on this platform. So please welcome back into your ears, Emily M. Bender and Alex Hanna. Emily M. Bender and Alex Hanna, welcome to the podcast. Welcome back, Emily. Welcome, Alex. I am so excited to have you both here.
It's a great pleasure to come back. I love what you do on this podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, just starting off, introduce yourself. Emily, you've been here before. Alex, you haven't, but you co-wrote a book. It's called The AI Con. It's out May 13th, 2025, published by HarperCollins Press. Huge deal. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, super excited. So I'm a linguist, which is how come I've been on your podcast before. I teach linguistics and computational linguistics at the University of Washington. And I have been collaborating with Alex for something like 5 years now on a variety of projects, culminating, although that might not be our last thing. The current high point is our book.
Yeah, and I'm Alex Hanna. I'm a sociologist. I am director of research at the Distributed AI Research Institute. Been focusing on kind of the intersection of technology and society for all of my career, I guess. And yeah, we've been working on a number of things with the podcast, the book, several papers, several op-eds. And yeah, it's a nice place where sociology and linguistics complement each other very nicely.
Yeah, so say more about that. AI, which we always put in quotes, or it's always put in quotes, or sort of shrouded in some kind of like mysticizing language with your guys' papers and podcasts. But tell me about that. Why a sociological and linguistic viewpoint on AI?
Sure. I mean, the kind of interesting thing about this and being in the space of looking at the interaction of technology and society for this long, I think a lot of folks, especially if they're approaching a conversation about AI, they think that they don't have a lot to contribute because they're like, well, I don't know a lot about the technology. And that's something that we often get like, well, I don't know exactly how it works. And to that, I say, well, okay, but you know everything around it. You know, there's impacts that things have in society. So, I mean, that's the first thing. Technology impacts society, and people who are sociological minded or anthropological minded or whatnot can bring a lot because you can still study a technology's effects. And so I'd say that's the first part of it. The second part of it is because sociology is kind of the study of institutions and organizations and power and inequality. And especially in our AI hype moment, these are the things that are paramount, especially as they now interfere at every part of government and kind of affect markets, affect people on the day-to-day.
Yeah. And linguistics, I think, has a couple of things also. So on the one hand, what everybody's so excited about right now is large language models. And large language models are large, but they're also language models. And that comes out of computational linguistics. And so just sort of being able to demystify what's going on. And honestly, it's linguistics that's super important because the computer scientists who are involved in this don't really understand how language works. And they think that by modeling the distribution of spellings in text, they're actually modeling language. And linguistics says, no, actually, there's much more to that. That's part one. Part two is that why these things are so convincing to us has to do with how we process language. Again, linguistics is going to tell us what's going on there. I think I said two, but there's a third one. And the third one is talking about hype. Right? So from a linguistic point of view, just doing that close textual analysis of how do these words work, what is going on in the anthropomorphizing language, for example. There's also, I think, sociological viewpoints on hype and sort of how it plays with power institutions. And so that's been great. And I also just wanted to add that co-authoring across disciplines like this, I think, was really valuable in creating a book that's accessible to the broad public because we could catch each other on technical terms and like presuppositions that weren't shared. But also, you mentioned before about the quotes on AI. Like, I never want to use AI without taking some distance from it. And so all over the place, it was so-called quote AI. And Alex said, Emily, you can have so-called or you can have the scare quotes, but you can't have them both at the same time.
Yeah. And as you said, this book is really very accessible, to a general audience. And I read it over the past few weeks. Can you just talk a little bit about your process writing it and sort of the balance between the sociological and the linguistics and the computational stuff?
Yeah. So, the book grows out of the podcast, and the podcast is an accidental podcast. So anybody who picks up Mystery AI Hype Theater 3000, we encourage you to start with more recent episodes first, and then only go back to the early poor sound quality ones if you really love what we're doing. But sort of what started happening with the podcast is that we were collecting what Alex dubbed fresh AI hell. So all of these terrible applications across all of these different domains of endeavor of, social services and science and healthcare and journalism and all this stuff. And so by the time we started working on the book, we actually had this big collection of sort of like bad use cases. And we sort of created an outline out of okay, what do we need people to know? And then how do we group together the various things that we've been seeing? And there's the chapter on creativity pulls together, I think it's art and science and journalism is in that chapter, if I'm remembering correctly, which is maybe a little bit of a surprising choice, but we sort of found the common threads like social services and creativity as a way to batch those together. So we had the outline, and then it was a very collaborative writing thing where like there's no word that wasn't touched by both of us ultimately. But like we took turns outlining chapters, and then within a chapter we took turns drafting sections, and then we edited each other. And coming from two different disciplines, as I was saying before, is super important because we'd be like, I don't understand this. And then that forced the other one of us to like really get down to, okay, what's the thing I'm trying to get across here? How do I make it clear?
Yeah. I mean, I think the disciplinary backgrounds, as we mentioned, where we come from, thinking, with Emily, thinking very much in this background of computational linguistics, my kind of like more of I said science and technology studies background, but also kind of a focus on institutions. That's really where the sauce is. And there are certainly places where, Emily took the lead. There's parts where I took the lead and kind of looking, especially kind of in parts that focus on a kind of like a historical or kind of like the areas on intelligence, which is, I think sociologist and feminist science and technology studies folks address quite a lot. Yeah, but very, very collaborative. We've read each other's work so much.
And just for a little linguistic flourish here, thinking about sort of what kinds of things got pushback across the two of us, oftentimes things that I had written, Alex would be like, Emily, this is too far in the weeds. And some of that stuff ended up in what we called the Sleeping Kittens file, and some of it ended up in endnotes. So if you want more, definitely check the endnotes. But also, I think sort of contrary-wise, oftentimes I was focused on the connectives that Alex was using. There'd be like a therefore or however, and I'm like, there's a presupposition that is making this connective work for you that I am missing. And that had to do with her knowledge of sociology and related expertise. And so by sort of pinpointing those, I was able to sort of prompt Alex to make the connections clearer to somebody who doesn't have all of that background.
And I think I also want to say something I appreciate about the book is that a lot of times books and writing on this kind of technology feels like it's like slipping out from under you because we're like moving so fast, right? Like everything's moving so fast and going so quickly. And there's always like these new technologies that are really flashy and bright and saying we have this new thing and now this other practice is outdated. You'll never have to do this again. It's all automated or whatever. And like even little details in your book about like how many children Elon Musk has, wrong, outdated. There are more now. But like you sort of hedged that. You said at one point, like Elon Musk now has like blank number children, parentheses, that we know of. And sure enough, we now know of more. And so like, there's just like something there that I guess I particularly admire of like this way of like slowing down, writing this thing and understanding and wrestling with the fact that like it's all kind of on shaky ground.
Yeah, we did try to future-proof it in the sense that we were talking about the hype of this particular moment, but trying to talk about it in a way that will help people deflate the next hype bubble. And also like making sure that, because book publishing is slow. Like this is fast. We submitted the manuscript on September 16th and it's coming out on May 13th. And that's like breakneck pace for publishing. But we knew that we had that lag already. So we were sort of working with that. And we ended up at the point that we were doing, I think like the second pass galleys, discovered that some official U.S. government documents that we were citing had been taken down because of the administration change. And so we had to fix some of the endnotes to point to Wayback Machine Internet Archive links to the things we were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, that was a conversation we were having a lot with the publisher too. Like, well, this is, it's going to read, technology books, one of their kind of features is that it's going to read kind of as a little dated, right? And I mean, the thing is, there's the books that, we admire that are the technology books that we really admire, Ruha Benjamin's Race After Technology, Virginia Eubank's Automating Inequality. I mean, these are books that are evergreen for a few different reasons, like Race After Technology does what it does very well because, it doesn't have to be, she talks in the book about facial recognition and ankle monitors. And I mean, unfortunately, those are things that are very prevalent and are still here. But even in the future in which they weren't, I mean, the way that she structures the book is that you're talking first about technologies which are race antagonistic or antagonistic to Black people, to technologies that purport to be inclusive towards Black people, but are still antagonistic and anti-Black. And those technologies have a long history, right? In which, they go back so far back in thinking about photography and thinking about those histories. The same thing with Virginia Eubank's text. It talks about the digital poorhouse to start, this long historical scope, which is saying the poorhouse has been around for a while. Let's talk about how it's been digitized, and let's talk about automated technology systems and automated decision-making systems. Those are going to be with us, and they're going to increase because it is a continuation of existing social processes. And so I think that thought really went into this book. Okay, these are technologies that are making promises about labor, about social services, and about creativity and doom and gloom and climate change. Those are pretty evergreen. And it's about a market bubble, right? Those are things that we can talk about even if we get GPT-5, GPT-6, or whatever.
Throughout the book, you make fun of AI. There's definitely a lot of like de-hyping and deflating of this like huge, like overhyped AI situation. But then there's also like real gravitas going on here because this is kind of scary, not only from the perspective of like people trusting AI so much and placing so much faith in it and overhyping it to a large degree, but then also like how convincing it can be and how difficult it can be to tell whether you're encountering authentic text or synthetic text. So throughout the book, you basically argue at several points that AI is not actually the real problem here, but rather a symptom of larger problematic trends that have been going on for a long time. And so I'm going to pull out a quote. So you say at one point, we should realize that the turn to AI is a symptom of these trends rather than a means to challenge them. So if AI is not the means to challenge these problems, what is AI? And then what are these problems and what would be the means to challenge them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the different area that we're thinking about, right? So, the way that the book progresses, we talk about work, we talk about social services, we talk about science, we talk about journalism, right? And I'm assuming, I don't know exactly where that quote is from, but I'm assuming it's from one of these elements, these parts about science or journalism. And, I think one of the things that we hope to do is situate where this technological intervention comes in these social systems, right? So journalism is a field that, has been falling in prestige and wages and whatnot for a while, not because of AI or not because of these particular media extruding technologies. I mean, journalism has been declining for quite some time, due to the decline of advertising revenues, due to the incursion of private equity and venture capital, due to a whole host of institutional factors. And and so now there's this technology that's like, oh, okay, so instead of having a bunch of content creators or stringers that are just producing reams of content, we could, that for the content minds, we can now turn to these this technology which produces reams of content and doesn't have to be paid or can be fixed by gig workers. And so it's important to sort of point to the ways in which these are institutional factors that have led to situations in which these technologies become an appropriate alternative. And I think it really depends on which industry we're looking at, but that's the kind of understanding, right? I mean, you have to look at the institutions, the incentives, and where is it a place in which people with power find it useful to use a text extruding machine to replace actual human labor.
Yeah. I got to speak to the Pac-12 Deans Conference back when there still was a Pac-12. It was hosted at the University of Washington, and they wanted me to come talk to them about AI. And so here I am talking to like deans from all up and down the West Coast. And what I got to say to them is, in 2022, 2023, when all of a sudden this became the thing that everybody had to do because ChatGPT was launched and everyone was excited about it, that was not because there was some enormous breakthrough in technology. That was because the reason it became the dean's problem was because there's a whole bunch of money pushing this. But it gets pushed not as, hey, we're making money doing this. And in fact, they're kind of losing money all the time. So it's a little bit mysterious that way. But it gets pushed as we're democratizing access to things, which, coming in with my linguist hat again, that's not what democracy means, right? So they talk about now anybody can be an artist. Well, yeah, anybody could be an artist if they had the sort of free time and, food and shelter and healthcare given so that they would have time to dedicate to honing their craft. Sure, anybody could be an artist. Just being able to type some things in to get an image extruded back out that's based on the stolen art of a bunch of actual artists doesn't make anybody an artist. But also, democracy means shared governance. So the other thing that I told the deans that I think applies in many cases is that when you look across the university and you see where people are using ChatGPT, like the way in which ChatGPT is actually useful to university administrators is as a contrast die test.
Yeah.
In that it tells you these are the situations where there wasn't enough resources for people to do the thing they should have been doing. And so they turned to this substitute. And I think that applies across a lot of industries as well.
Yeah. In school, right, we can think about this as like, are students being given the correct tools to answer the problem on their own, or are they outsourcing AI and other technologies because they don't have the resources to do this work or the interest? I would say that's probably my hunch, is that there's no real interest there, which is a problem with the way that we present history and knowledge, I would argue. But then also, in the past few weeks, we were on the verge of last week we were on the verge of a worldwide recession. And then there were all these articles that came out that seemed to suggest that perhaps Trump's tariff plans were ChatGPT generated or AI generated. Several news outlets reported on this, including Newsweek, sort of saying, if I'm plugging this into an AI, it seems to produce these exact tariffs. And as we know, didn't seem to be a lot of real critical thought behind those, because look what happened and look what the economists told us would happen all along. And so, is that kind of what we're talking about here when we talk about like the broader problem?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit different, because I think that many of the people who are turning to so-called AI are doing it out of actual goodwill, right? You have a lot of people who sort of say, like, we need to make sure that all students have access to as much whatever. And I'd like to believe that that actually comes from a place of goodwill, even as it is like demonstrably harming education to say, well, you can give them AI tutors. I don't think anybody in the Trump administration actually cares about providing public services or taking governmental actions that benefit anyone other than themselves. So it's not quite an example there, but it is sort of, in a sense, like the beyond example of it. And similarly, like, Elon Musk and Doge saying, well, we're going to set up the GSAI as a chatbot to answer questions. And there's, wonderful threads out there now by people who actually worked on the Government Services Administration. I think that's what GSA is. Their AI sandbox, where they basically said, yeah, this is how we're testing these things out, and none of them can function the way we need them to function. And then Doge comes in and basically just like turns that on. It's okay, now you have AI. And so it is beyond in the sense that I expected the problem to take the shape of well-meaning people getting taken in by the AI hype and turning to this stuff when it's not going to actually be able to fill the need. And instead, what we have is people who are demonstrably not well-meaning, turning it on and not even like trying to make the case that it fills the need. So but it is like sort of, the extra caricature version of it, I guess.
Yeah, I think just to put a finer point on it, I think there's a difference between people who are situated in institutions in which they're pressured to do more with less. And then there are, sometimes there's actually bad people and bad faith actors who are saying, we're going to come in, this is really deploying this technology because we think you could probably do this, but they just don't understand how complicated governance is. This is kind of a problem. I think it's sort of a tech mindset coming to government, which happens a lot and is almost its logical conclusion of, we can replace you with something that does not do anything nearly what you can think it can do. I mean, and we're seeing this with the tariffs. There's the claims that the Doge boys are going to be able to replace I don't know how many thousands of lines of COBOL into Java using an LLM, which is a horrifying proposition. And so, there's an idea that these things are sufficient. And I mean, but then the thing is, when it breaks, it's not going to matter to them. And, some people want to do the right thing and want to have accountability. I would say most people. But in this case, yeah, I mean, the kind of arbitrariness is kind of the point.
Just to kind of back up there, I feel like the fact, though, that like government actors would be relying on AI says a lot, right? Because you'd think that maybe those decisions would matter to the degree that we would want to trust human intelligence. And I think this is different from other issues. There was an article, Wired article several months ago, that talked about how a study was done that said that the more people trusted AI, the less they were likely to really understand the technology behind it. But that's different than, I think, like the more that one understands vaccine technology or like public health interventions, the more one understands, I don't know, history, the more like aware we are of where it's going to repeat itself. And the more we understand public health, the more likely we are to believe in it and want public health interventions. Why would AI be different?
Because it's fake. Is the very short answer to that, right? So the better you understand sort of vaccines and the science behind them, and the fact that it's about herd immunity, for example. Right? So you're protecting yourself, but you can't protect yourself all on your own, and we all have to do it together, right? The more likely you are, I think. I mean, I don't know the science behind vaccine hesitancy, but I believe you that people who have a deeper understanding of the science are more likely to also make the choice to get vaccinated. In the case of the more you understand about what's going on with so-called AI, the less you trust it because there's no there, right? And so better understanding basically better positions you to say, yeah, I'm not going to use that. I can see through the sort of glib, people-pleasing text that's been extruded to understand that I may as well be asking a magic 8-ball. And if I care about the answer, I'm not going to ask a magic 8-ball.
So does that all complicate sort of the argument that you've made a lot, which is that we don't actually need to understand the technological backing of these technologies to not believe in them?
Alex brought this up earlier, talking about like sociology, anthropology, super duper relevant because you understand the social systems that the technology is coming into. And I think the reason we make that argument is that you have the people producing the technology saying that they are the only ones who can comment on it. That if you haven't built one of these yourself, then you are in no position to talk about anything about them. And they like to say this. They like to say this in particular to regulators, to say, "Oh, you can't possibly regulate this because you don't understand it," right? And I think that there is an interesting sort of failure point in this correlation, right? So the Wired article, which was reporting on someone's science, I think it wasn't just the journalist who did this survey, but this Wired article about how the more you understand about the systems, the less likely you are to trust them, falls apart when you get to the people who are all in on this being the God they have built. And so there's this sort of extra group of people who, not everyone, right? There are some people who work with language modeling technology who are very clear-eyed about what it does. And then you have Sam Altman and co. who are like, yeah, we're building AGI, right? And those are the ones most likely to say to people like me, oh, your expertise is irrelevant. You can't have anything to say about how this should and shouldn't be used, anything to say about regulation because you haven't built one.
Right. And the additional thing is that understanding it is a pathway to understanding what the parlor trick is and seeing that it is a random word generator. It's also not the only pathway to understanding that it's bullshit, especially if we're in different areas of expertise. The artists who are fighting against having their work hoovered up and used to train these systems know that it is a market infringement on their work and know that they need to push back against it. The people who are targeted via different kinds of uses in government, whether that's chatbots to offer tax advice or employment law. If you know that work, then you know it's bullshit. Understanding is one of the mechanisms that we hope is a path of inoculation against the trash. That's why we spend a lot of time talking about like how it works in the book. But it's not the only way. Lots of folks know that it is going to hurt their livelihoods by offering a shoddy attempt at a replacement for their work and their output.
I also would just bring up, a historical example of this, of something that you said, Emily, about people telling regulators that because you don't understand this technology, you can never attempt to regulate it properly. Elizabeth Holmes, that was her whole argument with Theranos. That was her whole thing, on stage with she was on stage with Bill Clinton and, of course they understand nothing, but her whole thing is well, I can't actually tell you the science behind it because one, that could give my competitors something that I don't want. And then two, you could never possibly understand it properly, so you can never regulate me. So why don't I just defraud investors and create a fraudulent product? This has definitely happened before.
It's a common Silicon Valley thing, right? It's not that the obfuscation that, Zuckerberg, offered in Facebook, and the famous kind of moment in which he says, "Senator, we sell ads," and that's the sort of well, how do you actually make money? And you don't need to know a lot about you don't need to know how eigenvector centrality works to talk about Google search and how Google search results could be hurtful or can deprioritize. You don't need to know about eigenvector centrality. It can help to understand PageRank, but at the end of the day, you can see its effects, right?
And I would argue that someone who's entirely focused on the inners of the algorithm is less well positioned to understand the harms than people who are looking at how people are interacting with the technology. Which isn't to say we don't need computer scientists in the conversation, but we need them in the conversation as sort of a field among equals where other people are also contributing their expertise.
This all relates to a theme just throughout, which is just general Western epistemology and your critique of it, saying, this is dangerous, especially now. And you bring this up in a really interesting way, which is talking about the devaluing of what it means to be human, which is kind of a chilling statement, but I really appreciated the way that you sort of analyzed it. But you have this great quote from that particular section of the book. I want to cite my sources properly. And you say, the devaluing of what it means to be human is apparent not just in the application of these technologies, but in their very conceptualization. Methods of defining and measuring intelligence have been more than complicit in this project. Indeed, they were designed specifically to do such a thing. So to me, this is like going after two main arguments that both of you separately have made in your work over the years, going all the way back to the stochastic parrots article, which is one, you argue that the effects and the outputs and the functions of synthetic text extruded from synthetic text extruding machines are not a problem because of what they highlight or reflect, but rather because of their design, like what's actually going on the back end. This isn't just like the LLM reflecting biases that are present in the world. The LLM is designed in a particular way that you find problematic. And then second, you have argued that Western epistemological orientations devalue other intellectual traditions and by extension sort of devalue other ways of being human and other cultures. So kind of all of that, but like starting with really this argument about devaluing what it means to be human.
Yeah, I mean, it's in so many different parts of it, right? So anytime the people selling this say, oh, this synthetic text extruding machine can replace your work as whatever, that basically says your work is completely encapsulated in the text that you produced in doing that work. None of the rest of it matters. None of the human experience of it matters. None of the human connection involved in it matters. You are just a system for producing text. I can make an artificial system for producing text. That's just as good. That is very much dehumanizing. But Alex is the one who took the lead on the sort of history of intelligence. Part of this is where it really gets into it was never innocent. And it was always designed to do that. So I want to pass the mic over to Alex.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the first question relates to the second question, which is the kind of idea of rank order intelligence, right? I mean, in this section is very much into a lot of the kind of focus here in thinking through how a reification of intelligence is always a dangerous proposition, right? I mean, this is kind of where eugenicist projects form and have their scientific racism roots, right? And so it's telling where we talk about specifically the Sparks of AGI paper and the Bubeck paper, because not that they, necessarily, believe this or, like this is not to impugn, Bubeck or his beliefs or anything, but it is indicative that Bubeck and his co-authors kind of were reaching for a definition of intelligence, and this is kind of where they landed, because that kind of defining of intelligence or ranking ordering of intelligence has almost always led to a type of eugenicist end or a focus on this. And so we're seeing this kind of in, what is it? So the human biodiversity or which is kind of a code for these white supremacists who are attempting to do kind of rank ordering by race or rank ordering of human intelligence by cognitive ability or by disability. And so it's important insofar as it's focusing on this language that we do see still and being used by OpenAI, PhD level intelligence. They're now selling this $20,000 agent that it says has a PhD level intelligence, which, those of us with PhDs, and we say this in the book, we kind of laugh about it. We're like, this person's going to like burn out and they're going to open a bakery or something.
Also, $20,000 a month. How many PhDs are making $20,000 a month?
Yeah, exactly. And the kind of thing with that, well, just in terms of like, I don't know if you would call this necessarily a Western epistemological tradition, but it's a notion that like there's a kind of a way to kind of first measure intelligence, rank it, and then give it kind of a reference. Like it's a claim isn't that OpenAI wants to like hire PhDs, and like think that PhDs are worth $240,000 a year. It's that it is a referent to a level of intelligence. And so then it becomes not only that, but then it becomes superhuman, that becomes a referent. And, there's an idea that like it is some kind of an intelligence that is something that you accrue through more and more, I don't know, book learning, and so, and so I think that's very, very dangerous in terms of thinking about that. And this is sort of like the devaluing, as Emily mentioned, of what knowledge is, about what wisdom is. I mean, they make references to intelligence, not wisdom. these are different character stats in Dungeons and Dragons. And so I always have to tie it back to D&D.
This is Alex's epistemology is D&D.
Yeah, it's D&D, not just playing it recently. And so like there are different kinds of knowledges that become reference. I mean, and so, we make like a little reference in the book to, the ways in which science is now at a point where Western scientists are turning to other traditions. They're turning to Black traditions, indigenous traditions, understanding that, if you're going to understand a phenomenon, then it is not an understanding of humans as like the best intelligence. It is an understanding that are different, that there are different types of intelligences, and that human beings exist in a world and in a relationship with the environment. I was reading Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, in which, she has this great anecdote in the piece of when she asked her her ecology students, like, can people be, are they actually part of nature, or do they always hurt it? And all of them say, humans always hurt nature, we're not actually in relationship with nature. And, she tries to flip that on its head and said, like, like in indigenous knowledge, and I believe she is part of the Potawatomi Nation. She says, like, in sort of that early ethos, people are in kind of a right relationship with the land and with plants and animals. So that is turning that notion of intelligence, first off, throws intelligence out the window, and it focuses on the types of wisdom and, what different beings teach each other.
Yeah, and I just want to put a shout out here to Ruha Benjamin's conceptualization, what she calls ancestral intelligence. And I read that as sort of a co-opting of the AI acronym and not really like doubling down on the notion of intelligence, but the idea that there is wisdom in communities and wisdom in what's passed down from the ancestors, and to look at it not in terms of how do we rank people and can we rank the machines along with the people, but rather how do we work together? How do we learn from each other? How do we stay in community? And how do we, honor what we have from our ancestors, which I think also makes a lot of sense and fits in with what you're talking about with the indigenous traditions as well.
Can you say a little bit more about sort of how AI isn't just reflecting back what already exists, but is retrenching problems and creating new ones?
Yeah. So this goes back, we aren't the first ones to have said this, but it is in the Stochastic Parrots paper. So there's this idea that these data sets are so large that it's basically just everything, right? ChatGPT is trained, people say, on the whole internet, which is a great shibboleth for somebody who doesn't know what they're talking about, because the internet is not a thing you can go get somewhere, right? In order to get stuff from the internet, you actually have to crawl the internet, and then you have to choose what to crawl. And the people who are creating these large language models, and in 2020, when we were writing the Stochastic Parrots paper, it was instigated because Dr. Timit Gebru saw around her at Google this drive to like do bigger and bigger and bigger, and it was her job as a research scientist in AI ethics at Google to sort of say, well, what could go wrong? And so she and I started having this conversation about what is known already about what could go wrong with making this bigger and bigger. And one of the things about these enormous data sets is that they are just beyond the scale where you can do thoughtful curation, beyond the scale where you can document what's in them. And so folks got away with saying, oh, it's just the whole internet. That's everybody. So therefore it must be diverse. And in the Stochastic Parrots paper, we go through and say, well, no, first of all, it's not the whole internet. And secondly, it's not everybody, right? If you think about the whole world, not everyone has access to the internet. Not everyone comes from a position where they can comfortably contribute, right? And there's all of these stories and data showing that people from any kind of marginalized identity are more likely to get harassed off of the kinds of sites that are used as a starting point for these crawlers. And then all of the sort of cleaning and down selecting sort of further skews things towards a hegemonic point of view. So the data set wasn't representative to start with. We don't really know what's in it. And then on top of that, when you apply statistical algorithms to things, you are basically setting things up to take whatever slight difference and amplify it. Because this is the more likely thing. Even if it's only a little bit more likely, then that's going to get reproduced. And so that's the ways in which it is not just society sucks. and we have all kinds of bigotry that is being expressed. That's true. That's part of it, but it's more than just that.
Yeah.
And also, Meg Mitchell talks about your choices of optimization metric are also choices that are being made that are going to shape the output of things.
Yeah, and this is a meta conversation about the bias framing, because the bias framing is also one that's very easy to co-opt. And there's a great piece in N+1 in which this author, she goes to this conference on like voice technology, and she, and this conference on voice technology, and she's going to talk about bias, and the people are like, yeah, we know. And the solution, is to, have people, more representations of people from marginalized identities in the data set, which is not, it's so the answer can be solved by more surveillance capitalism, which is a frame that gets adopted and co-opted very quickly. And then that's not the point. The point is there's a lot of other decisions that are being made. And if we need to know what's in the data, we need to know what's in the algorithm. We need to know, what are the representations that are being made, and then, then different choices need to be made, and these things are not being disclosed at all.
And what about the technologies that sort of do like the AI checker? So like plug in this job posting to see if it has like gendered language, things like that.
So there's a company near Seattle called Textio, started by the linguist Karen Snyder, that does this really nice data-based approach to helping employers put out job descriptions that attract more gender diverse applicant pools. And the way that they did this was they basically got a bunch of companies on board to share their data so that as they put out job postings, they could track which kinds of words correlate with more or less diverse applicant pools. And then they could turn that into a word processing thing that would allow you to say, okay, you've written a job posting, put it into the Textio's app, and it'll say, because you've said we're looking for, someone who's, a 10x engineer or a genius, so whatever these things that are like super male coded, if you do that, you're not going to get the diverse applicant pool you're looking for. That to me sounds like a really excellent use of text processing. Like I think Textio is doing something valid. And as far as I know, last I checked, they were not calling this AI, right? But you asked about AI checkers. So another type of AI checker is, can you tell whether text was synthetic or authentic just looking at the text alone? And the answer to that is, unfortunately, not automatically. Sometimes as a reader, you can get a really strong sense that this is synthetic, but there is no reliable way to check because the systems are specifically designed to mimic the form of text that people write. And so anyone who is in education who is using AI checkers to police what their students are doing is like, I understand the goal to make sure that students aren't using this, to make sure students are learning, but using the AI checkers is not a way to achieve that goal. In short, if you're a teacher, don't do cop shit.
I think I want to get to this place where part of this book was, or at least it ends in a place where you talk and you sort of celebrate the fact that actually, although we have all this doom and gloom and everyone's telling us that AI is going to take over like every industry and all our jobs, your sort of mode is ridicule as praxis, right? That's kind of the MO, ridicule as practice. And as you say, it can be fun. Like this is part of all of this for you, is that this is like actually quite funny. I mean, on your podcast, Mystery AI Hype Theater 3000, yes?
Yeah.
You've gone through, like articles or like things produced by some LLM. And it's just like really funny because they're so stupidly written. And that's not all synthetic text output. But sort of what's going on there? How do we get to a place where ridicule is praxis? And then also, really, how is this fun? And I mean, like, because I'm a little bit like, ooh, really? Like, this stuff's getting kind of scary. Like, tariffs introduced because some intern plugged it into ChatGPT. Like, that's,
I mean, so I have two approaches to this. So one is this sort of the idea of ridicule as a methodology. And the other one is thinking about it in very dire times. And so first off, ridicule is praxis. This is the premise of the podcast, right? I mean, we had to to get through this stuff, we had to laugh about it, right? I mean, just as a means of, it's really, really awful stuff, really dark stuff, death and, child sexual abuse materials sometimes and violence. And it's, stuff is dark, our future, our technological future could be dark. And so at the same time, these are claims that are being made by a small set of actors that are ab- like just patently absurd on the face of it. Just like if you're reading this and you're not, so deep in the sauce, this is the most absurd shit, And so what was it? There's some great YouTubers that talk about AI, and I'm trying to remember which was it, and it was like dealing with this piece of AI hype, and we talked about it on our podcast. She was also doing this. She was like, there's a claim being made about like some capability, and this YouTuber was just like, "What do you mean? Like, what do you mean you can do this? This is not how any of this works." And this YouTuber is very much engaging in ridiculous practice. Like, okay, let's take a step back. And so we like to, and this is what I would attribute to Emily, the kind of metaphor of the emperor having no clothes, right? I mean, people are like, well, I don't really understand it, but since I'm not in this, like I'm not in this field, maybe the emperor does have invisible clothing, and it doesn't take until this child says, no, this man has no clothes on, like laugh at this man. And it's actually this very important sort of methodology. And I mean, if we've learned anything from Kendrick Lamar in the past few years, is that trolling the hell out of your opponent is actually very effective. And it becomes one in which you can actually change the power. And it becomes sort of, to paraphrase James Scott, this is kind of a weapon of the weak, this is a thing that anybody can do, right? The second part of it that I want to mention is in these times of like tariffs and war and whatnot, I mean, it's still something that you can do. I mean, it's still something that becomes effective. And, if we know anything about the people in charge right now, Elon Musk, Donald Trump, these are people with enormously thin skins, Uh, you know, Musk got bullied off of a gaming platform, which if he was actually running any of the things that he said he was running, he wouldn't have enough time for gaming. But he got bullied off a gaming platform because people were like, "You're terrible, you're a Nazi," etc. And he left. He crashed out. He left the platform. I mean, so we could. This is an ability to actually take some power back. I mean, even and it is necessary, and it's also how we survive really dark times.
Yeah, yeah. And I think just to amplify some of what Alex is saying, the part of the con in the AI con is that this is fancy, this is special, this is too complicated, you couldn't possibly understand it, but look at all the stuff it can do. And ridiculous praxis is a way of basically puncturing that. And part of why I think it's effective is that it comes from a place of confidence. That when you are making fun of somebody else and you're doing it based in your own expertise, like we're coming for these guys, we're coming for them based on linguistics and sociology and what we know about the technology too. And we can do it with enough confidence to be like, yeah, no, dude is naked. There's no clothes there, and we're going to laugh at him for it. And one of the things that I've absolutely loved about the podcast is the way it has built a community around the podcast of people who didn't like what was going on, but sort of felt like they were the only one. And then you come into our live Twitch stream, which is how our podcast starts. And here's this whole community of people who are seeing things the same way. And we are sort of holding the flag, basically, and articulating it and saying, yeah, we can do this ridiculous practice and you can be part of this and you don't have to feel alone. I think that has been really valuable.
Yeah. I think my worry is that ridiculous practice is hugely powerful for taking power back and surviving, but culturally and interpersonally and in these smaller communities. And I worry that it's not enough on a systemic scale. I love Kendrick Lamar. They Not Like Us is a great song, and he trolled the hell out of Drake, and that Super Bowl performance was amazing and extremely intelligent and well thought through, and Trump was in the audience. and inaugurated. And like that, there's such a huge divide because like we had like the pandemic and Black Lives Matter, and there's just been like so much progress. And I noticed this too in like the way that people talk about like accessibility and bias and discrimination and inclusion. Like our language has really changed. And our understanding of like systemic racism has totally, like that understanding of systemic racism, I would argue, has become more hegemonic, but not at the largest, highest level, you know? And now, you know, Trump is like freezing billions of dollars in funding for Harvard and for Brown, where I am. And so that my worry is that it's so powerful culturally, but not enough at like a political, systemic, institutional level.
Right. We're not putting ridiculous praxis in as like, here's the thing that's going to solve everything.
Right.
It is sort of a step along the way. And like, just like you're saying, understanding of systemic racism is better now than it was 10 years ago.
Totally.
We still have systemic racism, right?
Totally.
Understanding it is not enough to, but it is an important step along the way. And I think that the ridiculous praxis both is effective, right? Just like, you know, calling J.D. Vance weird was getting some traction for a while. And it makes it easier to get through. Like these two things belong together. It helps people focus a bit, right? Like one reaction to folks who are really not on the AI hype train is be like, yeah, just keep that out of my sight. I am not interested. And like, that's okay. Like if that's where you are, that's fine. But if with ridiculous praxis, we can bring someone over to, yeah, and I'm actually going to push back. Like I feel like I'm part of, you know, the group here, and I'm getting the tools for how to articulate this. I am willing to read this whole book that is, you know, accessible, but also talking about dark stuff. And also, you know, we have endnotes in the book. Everything is cited. We cited our sources. So it is, you know, coming from an academic place, but I think the ridiculous praxis also keeps the reader going. And so I think it's got an important function that way.
Yeah, it's certainly not the end all be all. I mean, it is one tool amongst many. I mean, we talk about policy levers, we talk about collective action, we talk about labor unions. I mean, there are other bulwarks that we are trying to build. You know, Kendrick is also someone who makes a lot of money. You know, it's not like he's making tons of money off of this. You know, like he is also operating within the capitalist system. And at the same time, the act of ridicule is still an important it serves an important cultural function, right? And, you know, one of the things that I think I've seen on Blue Sky is, you know, there's so much of fascism that we're in right now, that is, you know, that is cultural and affective. And the fascists really want to try to be cool, but they're never going to be cool. And not to say that Emily and I are particularly cool. I just talked about Dungeons and Dragons, so like definitely not cool. But like, you know, there's a cultural function of resistance and pushing back that is important, and it needs to go hand in hand with other types of collective power, with policy, with a lot of different other mechanisms, right?
Where would you like to see AI used? Where would you like to see this technology used and not used? I know that both of you were recently quoted in an Ars Technica piece sort of advocating for like community-based technology and having this technology be able to like be tailored to communities and having them be able to decide, you know, how is this used on me? How am I going to use it? Rather than like the imposition of a lot of these artificial intelligence technologies. So where would you like to see AI go from here?
So the first thing that I always advocate for is actually dropping the term AI altogether. So the things that get sort of pushed under this umbrella are actually quite diverse. So everything from automatic transcription to you know, the synthetic media machines one way or another, to image processing in the context of you know, processing X-rays. So it's all diverse. Sometimes just spreadsheets. Oh, we have AI. It's a spreadsheet, right? So first of all, you know, disaggregating, and then saying, okay, in what cases do we want to do automation that is based on data collected from people? And I think it is really like what you quoted us as saying from that Ars Technica piece, when the people who are affected by it have a say, when the people whose data has been collected have done that in a consentful way, where it's opt-in and revocable, right? Where both the people using the thing and the people it's being used on have full transparency, have recourse, can refuse, then I think if those things are in place, we can get to beneficial applications of statistical processing of data sets.
Yeah, and some examples of that we talk about in the book have been, you know, one thing that we talk about is Teheku Media, was an organization that is developing machine translation and automatic speech recognition tools for the Te Maori language. The data is controlled by that indigenous community. The compute is controlled by that indigenous community. There are negotiations of what data can be used that are culturally sensitive, that are attentive to the kind of dynamics of who can access data in that community, and it's for something that the community needs, which I mean is this, it's not just in that language, but it's often, kind of mixed with English, this kind of means of communication. And I think those are, that's an organization we look at too. There's kind of a number of different African language startups that also are very attentive to that. And I mean, but that's certainly not what's envisioned by, the quote unquote AI, especially as this, these are things that are totalizing and colonizing, they're meant to do everything. That's not kind of a vision that really helps the majority of people.
Yeah. But just to be clear, you don't actually think that this is going to totalize and colonize everything. I mean, that's definitely a theme throughout the book is like, hang on a second, you're saying this is going to take over every industry. I'm not so sure.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, if we end up with so-called AI across every industry, that's not because the AI did it. That's because the people selling it and the people buying it made some decisions, right? It's always people. And, we could end up in that place because there are bad decisions that could be made. It would lead to, far worse working conditions. It would lead to far worse services for people who are relying on it and probably far worse products. So it is a possible future, but it is far from inevitable. And if it happens, it's because of the choices of people. And we hope that our book will get enough traction that more people will be empowered to refuse.
I really like that argument because it goes against a lot of the sort of pushback against anti-AI, so I guess like push for AI argument of like, oh, you don't hate AI, you just hate capitalism. This is just the next technology that's going to like make everything better, and that's just what you hate. And I like this argument of like, well, it's actually going to make products worse and services worse, which would be not in the interests of competitive markets. So no.
Yeah, but it might be in the interest, at least in the short term, of various venture capitalists who are fine to hate on.
Going back to that Ars Technica piece, Alex was quoted as talking about how worldviews get baked into technologies. And I'm kind of wondering, when we criticize technologies, are we doing that as a proxy for criticizing worldviews and kind of vice versa? Like, is that part of your hope here?
It's a great question.
Let me state that one more time because it's a good question and I need to think about it in a different framing.
Yeah. So the worldviews are kind of baked into this technology, and like that is totally apparent. Like, the way that it genders different jobs and thinks about different like ways that people fit into the world, right? But when we're criticizing technology, is that a way of criticizing worldviews? Are we criticizing technology as a proxy for criticizing worldviews? Are we criticizing worldviews as a proxy for criticizing all of the stuff that gets created within that world, whether it's technology or otherwise?
I mean, I think technology, there's certain kinds of understandings of technology. I mean, this is kind of a central insight into science and technology studies, right? The idea of if you have something that is framed in a particular way, it's because something is designed in a way to either, like give access to certain people and to prevent access to certain people. I mean, this is the kind of thing that, you can go all the way back to Langdon Winter and do artifacts have politics and talking about his in the kind of maybe apocryphal story of Robert Moses and the design of like bridges in New York and how bridges were designed to be low enough that prevented buses from entering into certain neighborhoods that would prevent Black people from entering those neighborhoods. So those are like literally the politics and design, that are in that. And I mean, and I think the reference in that article is more because there was this difference between AI experts and their views of technology and what kind of their sample of, well, first off, the sample of AI experts and the sample of the people who are kind of general population. And so, yeah, AI experts have a particular view of what the technology is. And I mean, that might be influenced by their worldview, and they can also be influenced by the technology for sure. But one thing that we do discuss is that like AI is a bit of a centralizing technology. I mean, if you talk about people like, if you consider Mark Andreessen an AI expert, which I don't necessarily, maybe by this definition, I don't think he's been published at any of these conferences, but he's surely funded. Many of these people have gone to these conferences. But if you consider Mark Andreessen to be an expert in this, he's someone that, thinks that we need AI and it will bring about, let me put that in very heavy quotes here, and it'll bring out this kind of amazing amount of market abundance. Consumer prices will drop to nothing, and we'll have fully automated luxury capitalism, right? Or we'll have fully automated luxury something, But the mechanism for doing so is that it is a centralizing technology. Effectively, you're going to have some kind of magnanimous superintelligence that's going to provide these things because it's going to magically solve X, Y, and Z. And that is, even though that there's an incredible amount of hand waving in what that thing is, it is a centralizing type of technology. And and certainly that outlines a worldview. That it outlines a worldview of kind of authoritarianism or a benevolent dictator of some sort. And so that very much outlines what is invented. I mean, so it's not just about kind of like this question of bias, it's about like what kind of society do you want to live in? What does it mean to have kind of individual and collective power? What does it mean to have someone saying, don't worry, this thing's going to take care of you?
Yeah. And I think another part of it is connecting the artifacts to the worldview can be really helpful. So when we talk about the environmental impact of these things, look to work by Friedman and colleagues where they talk about the immateriality of the cloud. So everything that happens in cloud computing, unless you happen to live next to one of the data centers and have your access to water and electricity impacted by the data center, the cloud is probably this abstract, light, fluffy, completely immaterial space, right? The big noisy machines are doing that off stage, and what happens on your own device is just, seems very lightweight. It seems I didn't drive anywhere. I didn't cause anything to move from one place to another. Clearly, this is environmentally good. And when we can draw those connections for people, I think it can help people make more informed choices based on their own values, right? People who value taking action against climate change might then start taking the extra step to insert or to enter -AI on their Google searches because that AI overview is like, I think Sasha Lucioni says it's something like 30 to 60 times more compute intensive than just returning the links, which is already happening even with the AI overview. And so if you know that, then that might help you make decisions, which is not to say that we are ever going to get out of climate change through individual action. But I do think that the way technology is marketed, it is often sort of marketed in a way that you have to look closely. You have to do the kind of analysis Alex was just doing to really see the worldview that it is espousing and reifying. And the work of sort of making that clear, I think, is useful work. And it's not necessarily only about critiquing the worldview, but connecting the worldview that people might already have certain opinions about to the artifacts that they're being sold.
It's that kind of like close reading to abstraction, like way that things work that is just awesome. I just want to say also, like when you talk about like Mark Andreessen and things like that, I think we're basically in plutocracy, and it's nice to recognize that like the money gets you the seat at the table, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they know what they're talking about. Like you said, like Mark Andreessen is like not a technology expert. Like Elon Musk was not like an expert on politics or political science or government. It's just that you can buy your way to a seat at these things and to positions of power.
Yeah, exactly. So back to ridicule as praxis, right? Like the specific details of the technology as marketed is far less interesting and far less relevant to our readers than how does this system work? What do you need to know to be able to spot the hype yourself, deflate the hype yourself? And those things we hope will be, well, it'd be nice to live in a world where people didn't continue to need those skills. But we hope that people will get them from our book because, unfortunately, we expect people to still need them.
I think that they will. But like I said before, this is so accessible and a joy to read. And I guess like I would hope that this book is totally going to arm people with the tools that they need to deflate this hype, particularly because you say at so many points, you don't need to know the whole back end. That's not what this is about. You need to have a critical angle about how this works politically, sociologically, culturally, epistemically, and then you can come to it and say, I don't think so. This is not what you're actually selling me.
Yeah, exactly. And when the next new thing comes around, it's going to have probably a different back end or different story about its back end, and that's not going to be any different, really, in terms of the kinds of questions we should be asking before we decide whether or not to use it.
Tell everyone where and when to buy your book, where they can see you. I know you're going on tour. Anything you want to shout out?
So you can find links to order our book at our website. And Alex made the amazing move of grabbing the URL, thecon.ai. So you can find everything there. Links to various ways to order the book, including bookshop.org, which supports local booksellers. You can also just walk into your local bookseller and request it there. You can walk into your local library and request it there. And thecon.ai also has our book tour events, which start, the in-person events start in the Bay Area in mid-May. We have Bay Area, we have Seattle, we have Midwest. And then Alex and I are traveling separately to other countries. And so keep an eye on thecon.ai/events for information about where we might be in the world.
You can also catch our podcast, which comes out about bi-weekly, and we do it on a live stream as well. And you can catch that at twitch.tv/DAIR_Institute. That's DAIR_Institute. And we usually tweet about this or tweet about this about when we're going to have those streams. And then you can obtain the podcast wherever you obtain fine podcasts. So Mystery AI Hype Beater 3000.
Thank you so much for listening to Tomato Tomato. I have been your host, Talia Sherman, and that was my conversation with Emily M. Bender and Alex Hanna, co-authors of The AI Con. You can find links to research and articles. That's all in the episode description. As a reminder, Tomato Tomato is also on YouTube, but whether you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Podcast Addict, whatever platform may grant you access to any podcast ever, please rate, review, and subscribe to the show. It helps out so much. And I will speak to you next time. Bye.